using a statue, a remarkable statue made by the Bakongo people as a portal through time and worlds between cultures on 3 different continents. But before we go there, I'd like to play a wax recording made by the Harlem Hellfighters regimental band, conducted by James Europe. The vocal is by Noble Sisel. It was recorded after they had returned to New York from fighting in the front lines on the Western Front in Europe. So here they are on the 14th of March, 1919. It's a little scratchy, so read along, read the lyrics. You'll see that basically what they're singing is instructions for how to survive in trench warfare.
What's the time? 9, all in line. All right, boys, now take it slow. Are you ready? Eddie, very good, Eddie. Over the top, let's go. Quiet, fly it, else you start a riot. Keep your proper distance, follow along. Cover, mother, and when you see me hover, obey my orders and you won't go wrong. There's a minute buffer coming, look out. Hear that roar, there's one more. Stand fast, for there's a very light. Don't gasp, for to find you all right. Don't start the bombing with those hand grenades. There's a machine gun, the holy stage. Alert, gas, put on your mask. Adjust it correctly and hurry up fast. Drop, there's a rocket for the fight barrage. Down, hunker ground, close you can, don't stand. Creep and crawl, follow me, that's all. What do you hear? Nothing near, don't fear, all clear. That's the life of a stroll when you take a patrol. Out in no man's land, ain't it grand? Out in no man's land. There's a minute buffer coming, look out. Hear that roar, there's one more. Stand fast, there's a very light. Don't gasp for to find you all right. Don't start the bombing with those hand grenades. There's a machine gun, the holy stage. Alert, gas, put on your mask. Adjust it correctly and hurry up fast. Drop, there's a rocket for the Bosch barrage. Down, hug the ground, close you can, don't stand. Creep and crawl, follow me, that's all. The boys, go to it! Hey! Get the bloody boys, get them, stick them with the bayonets on the ram it on.
So here we go. We're going to walk through that door. So first I'd like to thank the Mariposa Museum for inviting me to give this lecture. It relates to a statue which is on loan to the Mariposa Museum in their Oak Bluffs Gallery at the moment as part of a show called Freedom Songs. And I think it, although it's from Africa, we're going to see that it very much relates to the theme of Freedom Songs, which is focused on African American history. Thousands of Bakongo, which are the ethnic group who live around the mouth of the Congo River, fought for France and Belgium and Cameroon, Tanganyika, and Europe in the First World War. And thousands of them were killed. Tens of thousands of them were demobilized back to the Congo area after being wounded, and their bodies were often riddled with shrapnel bullets that couldn't be extracted. There were no x-rays at the time. There was very little way to pull out these things that had penetrated their bodies. Very often, after being wounded in World War I battles, they were patched up and sent back to the front, sometimes 3 times. And they rarely survived without being penetrated in some way, very much like the statue that we're going to be looking at, which in European parlance has been vulgarly, such statues have been vulgarly referred to as nail fetishes. In the context of the First World War, they might as well be called shrapnel fetishes. Some veterans came back shell-shocked with what we would call PTSD, and their eyes were as glazed as this statue's eyes. This statue has mirror eyes, other ones have mica. And they, as we'll see, this statue has a specific expression which seems to be a portrait of that was fixed on the faces of people who had suffered shell shock. These men, these Bakongo soldiers, brought back trophies, of course, from the battles that showed that they had been to the land of the dead. And literally, the land of the dead for them was the land of whites, of Europeans, because the Bakongo associated white with death and black with life. So the kaolin, which is a white clay, which is found underwater on the bottoms of streams, was symbolized death. So when they saw that it came from the other side of the shining surface of water, which was itself the symbol of the interface between dimensions, between the dimension of the living and the non-living. So we'll see that they associated white with death and or with non-life, the time between death and rebirth. These are people who believed in reincarnation. So when they first encountered whites, they thought of them as a class of the dead. And here in the First World War, they were conscripted and taken to the continent where the white imperial masters came from, and were forced into to fight in battles against whites. They were surrounded by death. And they came back, as I said, riddled, very often riddled with shrapnel and bullets, just like the Nkisi. So this statue is a mashup of metaphors, of objects that are laden with metaphorical significance, and that transform it into a dimensional interface. You're not only looking through the eyes, which represent the surface of water, so the interface between life and non-life, but through the glass of the belly box, the moyo, which is covered with probably cemetery dirt. And that, again, is a dimensional interface between life and non-life. The entire statue, in a way, is meant to be perceived as a dimensional interface where you can interact with the spiritual world. It's a door into that world and back to ours with many keys. These are drawings that I've done showing the various types of elements. Green, for example, relates to things made of metal. We see a trumpet on the far left, a horse bit that are two crescents across the chest. There are also bracelets. There are tacks. There are various musical instruments other than the trumpet, such as a bell just beneath it, and a whistle beneath that. On the back, we see more metal objects, including a crescent-shaped bracelet above a large antelope horn, and above that, a monkey skull. The red objects are, in fact, metal, but I've colored them differently because they are grenades. These are gas and training grenades, and so they are so surprising. None of them had ever been found on a statue from Africa before this one was analyzed. I now know I'd found a second one with the same grenades on it in exactly the same positions around the moyo, the belly box. So that itself means that this statue has, the discoveries concerning this statue are going to reveal things about other statues in its class. But before we unlock that door and pass through the dimensional membrane, as it were, or trap, we're going to have to plunge into the Congo and learn something about its history and geography. First, geography. There are more than 3 million Kikongo speakers, Kikongo being the language spoken by the Bakongo. And just a word about the prefix ba is the equivalent to our S, the plural. So Congo would be singular. Bakongo is more than one Congo person. So I will generally be talking about the Bakongo. And they were divided into different polities. The most famous one is the Kongo Kingdom, which is south of the Congo River. And then they were also along the Luango coast, which was one or up to 3 or 4 different kingdoms, depending on the moment in time, and that is north of the river. And we'll see that the Luango and Congo had quite contrasting histories. The whole area had iron and steel production quite precociously, quite early, around 300 before the Common Era. We see signs of hierarchical societies by no later than 100 of our era. In the 13th century, the Kongo Kingdom was founded. And then in 1483, Diogo Cao, a Portuguese explorer, made contact with the Kongo Kingdom and brought 4 ambassadors back to Portugal. Needless to say, Cao, the Portuguese explorer, was white, and therefore he was perceived as being dead, as sort of ambassador from the world of the dead, which was why he was perceived with some trepidation. He returned in 1491, basically with advisors. Some of those advisors were perhaps not the kind that would be been hoped for by the Congo monarch. These were priests, but they came ashore with prints of Saint Sebastian. And Saint Sebastian is riddled with arrows. So the Bakongo saw these prints and thought, well, these are quite similar to, I think, to our Minkondi, which they inserted. We don't know if they inserted metal into them that far back, but they certainly seem to have inserted wooden pegs into them, which had the same name. That would later be used for the metal hardware that was stuck into them. So there was a certain commonality in the iconography used by Catholics in the Bakongo around the time of contact. The introduction of Catholicism went through a difficult evolution of people becoming Catholics and abjuring Catholicism. There was the destruction of so-called idols. In 1509, for example, Alfonso I, Congo monarch, credited his victory over non-Catholics to Christianity and St. James. So he burned a lot of the indigenous sculptures. From early on, the destruction of indigenous objects, like the statue that we're going to be looking at today, was at the heart of the meeting up of these two cultures, of the contact between European and Bakongo culture. Interestingly, the Portuguese, later the Dutch, and other traders were not allowed to establish themselves on shore anywhere in the Congo zone until the 19th century. So although we might think of this area as having been colonized early, and it certainly suffered greatly from the slave trade, as we'll see in a moment, the Europeans were not actually, did not penetrate into the interior. So I'm going to let you peruse these slides for details that I'm not going to mention. They're great. I've loaded them up with a lot of information that you should be able to use to reconstruct the history of this period in detail. But some salient some salient features of this later period from 1815 to about 1914, from 1515 to 1914, is that Portugal and Congo, and to a degree Holland, entered into competition, into conflict. For a while, the Kongo Kingdom actually seemed to be developing very close relations with Europe. It sent an ambassador to the Vatican. An indigenous person was named a bishop. He would be the last Catholic bishop in sub-Saharan Africa, I believe, for 4 centuries. And basically what undid this period when Portugal, for example, was sending more advisors to the Kongo Kingdom, people who helped with urban planning, people who built water mills. The Kongo Kingdom realized that it basically faced a nation, a civilization that had more advanced technology. And they reacted in some ways like 19th century Japan to this by asking for advisors to come in to help them advance very quickly in an effort to protect themselves against people who they knew were not only their trading partners, but also potential adversaries. And then Portugal got Brazil, and Brazil was discovered, and Portugal won Brazil as a colony in a decision by the Vatican. And the indigenous people of Brazil began dying of the diseases brought in by Europeans. And the Portuguese looked around for manpower to use on the plantations that they were creating in Brazil. And they just looked across the Atlantic in the same equatorial region. They landed on the Congo and they thought, that's where we'll get our manpower. And they began to come into the Congo and basically divide and conquer. They would go to what had previously been the governors of a very hierarchical, very structured state, and give each governor weapons, incentives to enslave people, to basically become autonomous, to ignore the dictates of the Congo king. And this led to the crumbling of the Kongo Kingdom. And but still, despite this, the competition between Portugal and Congo continued right up until the second half of the 19th century. We're going to move north now of the Congo River to the Luongo coast in the three kingdoms there. I'd just like you to note that that hoop-shaped shrine at bottom left, where there's a statue inside it, and that statue could well be an antecedent of an Nkondi, like the statue that we're going to be examining in detail later. So here we're going to go into some of the contrasts between Luongo and Congo. Congo was, as I said, highly centralized, hierarchical. It was militarized. There were a lot of wars of succession and conquest. Luongo didn't really have standing armies, and the forces were usually about 200 or less. Congo records tend to be about politics, dynastic problems, for example. Luongo records are mercantile, they're about trade. And they used very graded local textiles of different levels of finish, of fineness as currency. This makes perfect sense because very fine textiles require so many hours to produce that they can be used, anything that requires a lot of labor can be used it becomes so rare that it can be used as a currency. The Vili people, they're a subset of the Bakongo, who live along the Luongo coast, were obeyed because they were perceived as being Minkondi, like the statues. The statues were supernatural chiefs made out of apparently, to a Western eye, inanimate materials, whereas the chiefs were seen also as being supernatural chiefs, but living ones. The Luongo actually competed with the Portuguese in selling slaves to Europeans, not just to the Portuguese, but they mostly got these people who they sold, and they sold a great many of them. About 1 million were sold over several centuries, about 10,000 a year on average, as I said, for centuries. And they sold them to whatever European slavers came to their ports. Congo, on the other hand, would also sold slaves, but they not only preyed upon populations in the interior who were not Bakongo, but they sold, because of their wars, their civil wars of dynastic succession and so forth, they often sold captives from among their own people. An odd thing about this phase is that the population actually expanded rather than decreased during the period of the transatlantic slave trade. And the reason for this was because new crops were introduced from the Americas: peanuts, pineapples, tomatoes, maize, what we call corn, cassava, manioc, and also breadfruit from Polynesia. And these increased the food supply so much that despite the horrible predations and the exporting of human beings, the population actually seems to have increased. And yet, we'll see that there was a population decrease in the Bakongo area and the Congo generally in the late 19th century. And that has often been inaccurately referred to as being caused by the slave trade. I don't think that that is, in fact, justifiable. During the slave trade, people living along the coast, not only in the the Bakongo area, but for example, the Benin and other kingdoms along the coast often prospered because they received guns and mercenaries and all kinds of things which allowed them to victimize people further in the interior and bring them to the coast, very often in chains, carrying heavy ivory tusk on their shoulders, and then both the ivory and the porters would be sold to slavers once they reached the coast. The wealth, though, that was the prosperity that was caused by all of this trading in humans and ivory and other things, allowed for the coastal populations very often to display extraordinarily ostentatious wealth. One way they displayed their wealth was at funerals, and in the 18th and mid-19th century, for example, in some of the Bakongo areas, corpses would be wrapped with so many textiles. Remember, these textiles served as currency, that they'd end up being 8 or 9 meters in circumference. But then along came the Industrial Revolution with its greed for commodities. And of course, we're still in that phase. We still see horrible things happening in the Congo because of the demand for coltan and diamonds, rare earths, etc. Congo is very rich in these. But back in the late 19th century, people were being terrorized to collect palm oil, copper, timber, beeswax. That should be gold dust, by the way. But mainly they were terrorized to collect wild rubber. This is rubber from lianas that produced a rubbery sap. And people were given quotas by the administrators of King Leopold of Belgium's personal colony. He came to own the Congo personally, and it wasn't a Belgian colony until it was taken away from him after an international uproar over his exploitative administration. And so his administrators imposed quotas on villagers. They had to go out, going farther and farther into the jungle, looking for the rubber-producing lianas, and then bring back the rubber, while their families were often held captive, hostages, and anyone who didn't produce enough rubber would be punished. And you can see some of the punishments here. People's hands have been cut off. This phase corresponds to a population drop, quite a severe one. It had, again, people have said, have called this genocide. It certainly is very close to genocide in its effect. There's some evidence, though, that people were moving away from the Belgians. So the Belgian census, to some degree, may reflect that the settlements along the river that they were familiar with suddenly became ghost towns because people had moved away from the river to get away from the Belgians, who moved almost entirely by water. The other thing is there was an outbreak of sleeping sickness that was particularly, that this epidemic was particularly severe in its effects, although sleeping sickness had been around basically forever. But the Belgians had weakened the population by forcing a lot of people to go and get rubber instead of farming. So they weren't producing the food, the nutrition they needed. And as a result, people were generally weakened and more vulnerable to sleeping sickness. In any case, in some regions, the population did decline 50% or more between 1885 and 1920. A great deal of this population decline or population movements, combination of the two, certainly, absolutely can be ascribed to the policies under King Leopold, which were genocidal in effect, although when he realized that sleeping sickness was depleting his workforce for getting rubber, he employed the finest tropical infectious disease experts in the world, who were in Liverpool at that time, to try to find the cure, because he didn't want his labor force disappearing. It was, regardless of what he wanted, though, because of his policies, disappearing. Before we walk through that door, that portal between dimensions, we might want to look at what's on the other side. There is a creator, Nzambi Amapungu. The cosmos is split between this world, associated with black, and the realm of the dead, associated with white. And these two worlds are divided, as I said, by the surface of water, symbolically. That surface on water can be of the great river, the Congo itself, Nazadi, Mopu, the ocean, so the Atlantic Ocean, Nalangu, which is water anywhere, and most especially the Kalunga. We're going to see the Kalunga over and over again. It is in a Congo cosmogram called the Dikinga, which is a circle with cross in it, the horizontal line across that cross, across that circle. And when you stand on the Kalunga, you are standing, as it were, between life ahead of you and non-life behind you, in the middle of a circle which represents the circle of life, life and death. The Bakongo also believe in ghosts, that their ancestors continue to have being and to be able to exert their wishes, and in spirits. So the ghosts, Nkuyu, and ancestors of ancestors become white. So you can imagine that when the Bakongo encountered whites, they thought that they were seeing simply representatives of a world of ancestors, the world of ancestors. The wild animals, interestingly, are seen as the domestic animals of the dead. This strikes me as extraordinary, because my African friends from other parts of sub-Saharan Africa have told me the same thing, including as far away as the Casamance in southern Senegal. So that particular belief may go back all the way to the Bantu expansion of about 3,000 years ago. Another thing the Bakongo believe is that things that happen in the visible world almost always have invisible causes. So they need to have people, traditional religious practitioners, and objects like the statue we're going to look at that can help them deal with those invisible causes. They have to invoke the help of Bakulu, Bizimbi, and Bakizi. These are the Bakulu, as we saw, are the ancestors, and the Bizimbi and Bakizi are local spirits. The spirits that empower the portable shrines, including the statue, are the Minkisi. Interestingly, they don't think that evil resides in spirits. It's in people's intentions. A few more words. Pembe, to be or become white, with all that implies. The Pembe, the blanched land of the dead. And this is identified with misty jungles, the underwater world, and kaolin, a very similar word, Pembe, found, as I said, on the bottoms of streams. Nkongo, hunter, hence we have the word Congo, and the statue we're going to be looking at is a supernatural hunter for justice. Kondo, to hunt alone and in secret, hence Nkondi. So the statue is an Nkisi, but the most important class of Nkisi. It's an Nkisi Nkondi, meaning because it is a supernatural hunter for justice. So what is an Nkisi? An Nkisi is this container of spiritual forces. It's the help of these objects is sought for becoming rich, finding a mate, blessing one's children, curing diseases, especially ones that cause, for example, the vomiting of blood, punishing thieves, but interestingly, not thieves who stole from white people, because whites clearly came to be seen practically as sort of an economic phenomena. Winning battles. This is really important because the statue in question has a lot of military allusions. Sealing pledges and alliances, sealing contracts, for example. When two people who wanted to enter into a contract wanted to pledge that they would abide by the terms, they went to the priest who controlled the Nkisi Nkondi, the Nganga, and asked him to seal their pledge by performing a rite, including the hammering of hardware into the statue at an appropriate place. Each place on the statue was a little bit like an acupuncture point. Different points on the statue had different significances. And so they would ask for the intervention of that person, and each pledge to respect the contract. If one of them broke the terms of the contract, it was understood that supernatural wrath would be visited upon him. And also, very importantly, the Nkisi were for punishing witches. Now, witches they were probably more often thought to be men than women. Outside of the European context, witches among anthropologists are understood not to be related, not to have any gender significance. They could be men or women, but they are people who either voluntarily or even involuntarily wish harm upon others and have the supernatural means to cause harm to them. In this case, a person was thought to be a witch if they had a kundu, a little inflammation or protrusion on their intestine, which was thought to be the witch's gland. You can imagine that upon killing someone for witchcraft and doing an autopsy, performing an autopsy on them, it was very easy to find some little bump on the intestines and say, oh, this person was a witch because they had the kundu. Minkisi could be anything from a pot full of so-called medicine. Medicine here is a term used for sort of sacralizing ingredients. Other religions use, such as the Abrahamic religions, use, for example, oils and incense as sacralizing materials. So the Bakongo did too. There were these recipes of the materials that basically enriched the object's power to be a supernatural interface are very complex. But everyone could be a Minkisi, from, not everybody, but a chief, as I said, was seen as an Nkisi, the singular of Minkisi. And a statue like the one Manjaka on the right was seen as being an Nkisi and also as a chief. A crucifix was seen as an Nkisi. In 1624, a Kongo catechism translated Nkisi simply as sacred, holy, or divine. The Minkisi were activated by Nganga. Nganga wore specialized clothing. They had bells that they used as part of the to activate they used them for ceremonial purposes and to maintain their trances. They would curse the statue. They would, in an attempt to provoke it into action, they would detonate explosions in front of it. They would also perform sacrifices before it. I should say that one form of sacrifice, for the most important in Minkisi, Nkisi Nkondi, was sometimes the sacrifice of a junior relative, often female, of a chief. So a human being sometimes was sacrificed as part of the sacralizing of the object, and the spirit of that person was called upon to inhabit the object, to be lodged in it. The object had to be created with enough care, both in its sculpting and in all of the attachments added to it, to be, as it were, like just the perfect birdhouse for a particular species of bird, to draw in that person's spirit temporarily so that that spirit could be used for the betterment of the community using the Nkondi. Some of these bananga were women, actually. Here we see a female Nganga with her Nkisi Nkondi and her clients. Here we see another one. A Nganga had to follow very strict rules concerning food, sexual intercourse, and the conduct in the period when he or she was interacting with the the supernatural through in Nkisi, especially in Nkisi Nkondi. So the most important Minkisi were these formidable statues pierced with metal. Had went by different names. One was Ready to Fight. Another is, as we've seen, refers to being the hunter for justice. And also Nkosi, which refers to felines, and because the spirits were lodged in the statue, the spirits lodged in the statue could strike a person in the chest like a leopard. Koza means to smash like a leopard's paw or a lion's paw, or destroy an entire village. Okay, just before we move on from the pictures at right, just note the round chamber on the belly, the moyo, and that it has a little cross-shaped partitions inside it. Here is the statue that we're going to be looking at, a divided top and bottom. So there were Minkisi were generally divided also, ones for the sky and celestial waters, which were seen as masculine, political, and violent. So the statue we're going to be looking at is an example of a masculine, political, and violent. Nkondi related to the sky. Then there are ones for sex, intestinal problems, childbearing, and those refer to the lower half of the body. We're going to see that this statue seems to have covered that as well. For example, it has a penis. It has two penises, as it were. One in the form of a grenade, and the other a very figurative wooden sculpture of a penis and scrotum, which is hanging over a gourd that has been placed so as to catch whatever comes out of the penis. The testimony of the person who described the use of this statue for the last 30 years after the last Nganga died was that it was only used for that during that period by women who sought to have children. And so they probably account for some of the seashells that had been hung around the penis, the penile area, the genitalia, as traditional links between their wishes, their hopes, and the statue's supernatural powers. So this statue, in fact, combines all the roles of Minkisi. Nkondi, the most important Minkisi, assured order and peace. So they would often be set up at large markets to prevent, they were seen as supernatural chiefs that through their supernatural powers would wreak their wrath upon any thief. They were commissioned by really powerful households, and they not only, of course, as it were, governed and helped assure order and peace, but they also increased the prestige and power of the households that had commissioned them. The importance of words. a lot of the objects that have been attached to in Nkondi um, can only be understood in terms of the words that apply to them in Kikongo. So, for example, tree snails, which there are 2 on this statue, very large tree snails, have basically are two-way pun, because one pun on their name refers to longevity and safe childbirth, and the other refers to a spiral, which is linked to the cosmogram, like the Dekinga, the 4 moments of the sun, the circle that around the circumference of the cosmogram. And so you wouldn't think, perhaps, that shell had so many layers of significance, and yet when you understand what it's called in Kikongo and the puns on the sounds, then you suddenly drop through layers into further layers of meaning. People spoke oaths. They took pledges in front of Nkondi. As I mentioned, when people wanted to enter into a contract, they would both pledge to respect the terms of the contract. But when witnesses were called to testify in front of a court to speak the truth, they also stood in front of the statue and pledged to tell that truth, just the way we use sacralized books to enforce honest testimony in our culture. Here's one of the oaths taken while sacrificing an animal and hammering in a nail. Between your village and mine, we have an accord. You may not seize hostages from us, and we will not seize hostages from you. If a person from one of our groups does something to the other group, we will meet to talk and will not fight. Preparing a packet, and so a supernatural agreement, and not speaking at the same time. This is a supernatural agreement that's attached, that's memorialized by, for example, the hammering in of a nail with some personal thing, a scrap of clothing or something attached to that nail, which connects that nail and this act to the person who has commissioned that act. And not speaking is akin to writing a letter and leaving off the stamp. It's not going anywhere, in Zoe Strother's terms. Zoe Strother, by the way, I should say, is a dear friend who is a professor of African art at Columbia University. And she came here to Martha's Vineyard and for what we called a Congo Fest with Richard Woodward, the curator of African art at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond. And we discussed my findings and their observations for 4 days several years ago. And I'm eternally grateful to them for all of their help. And Nkondi, without that moyo, that box on the belly, which contains sacralizing ingredients, is partially obscured with what's usually dirt taken from a cemetery, would be like creating a radio without an antenna, or an Nkondi is like a live radio with a working antenna in the names, in the words of Robert Ferris Thompson, one of the great Africanists. So the moyo means it means both belly, but it also means life. And the belly is seen as the center of being along with the crown of the head. The medicine, the sacralizing ingredients in the moyo are known as longo. The plural is bilongo. I will refer to them generally as bilongo. The entire statue is nolongo, but it's also a container of many forms of nolongo. So it's a super imposition of bilongo to create a kind of super enlongo. This ensemble, this set of ingredients ties in Kikongo and animates supernatural forces. It draws them in. The ancestor spirit, for example, is drawn in. The sacrificed person spirit may be drawn in. The spirit of a particularly successful hunter or wealthy man, a powerful warrior will be drawn in to be lodged in the statue for the use of the community. They are metaphorical illustrations of the Nkisi's power. As I said, they're relics of the dead, the cemetery dirt, for example. They may be miniature sculptures like the little wooden sculpture of an antelope head, which is on the back leg of the statue. An example of the relics of the dead is that one of the legs on the wooden, on the statue of a dog, which is part of this this religious assemblage. There were two statues in the same assemblage at the end. The big anthropomorphic statue, and then a statue of a dog known as Kozo. There were originally 6 anthropomorphic Nkondi in this chiefdom. The one that we'll be looking at was the one that was kept the longest, the one that was seen as being the most powerful, the one that was the last to depart for the West. Another metaphorical illustration of the Nkisi's power were musical instruments. On the bottom right, we see a military whistle with 2 suspension rings. This is the kind of whistle that was used in the First World War to signal to the troops to go over the top in the din of battle when they couldn't hear a voiced command. These musical instruments also refer to the whistle of the Ntoyo bird, which heralds death, and the Nganga, when hunting for a witch, out there either physically or projecting himself through space to find a malefactor, would use a whistle to signal that, like the Ntoyo, he was out to kill. We've looked at the witch's gland, the kundu, already. We've also referred to the shells that, for example, women may have attached around the genital area in the hope of having a supernatural gaining supernatural help to become pregnant and to have a successful and safe childbirth. Those personal objects attached to nails were referred to as mfunya, or dogs. Dogs, because dogs could follow an intruder even in the dark. They could go towards something that was, in this case, supernatural, without even being able to see. So they could guide the Nkondi to, for example, malefactors, culprits, and to potentially their loot. The Kundu is very problematic from a Western point of view. Having a growth on a bump on the intestines and saying that that means that a person is a witch, of course, does seem unfair, at least to me. But it was seen by the Bakongo as evidence of active hot witchcraft. And here's the testimony of an extraordinarily well-informed traditional religious practitioner. Kundu is the center of all issues when we talk about taking power from the world of the dead. It is the exact center of all the evil activities of the witch or antisocial being. And I think this should be read in a way which is metaphorically rich, which basically we're talking about a symbol of evil. And unfortunately, we know all too well that that some people who are greedy, narcissistic, egotistical, and so forth can visit evil upon our world. Nkondi came in brands. People are always drawn to brands. One brand was Munkundu. Now, it could be applied to not just to an anthropomorphic statue, but even to, in one case, is known to a wine bottle that was filled with sacralizing materials. When the big manjaka-like male statues with hardware all over them were such strong brands that they actually had franchises, and there would be other statues that were linked to the in the peripheral zone that bore the same name and that would be linked to the central one of the brand, as it were. Nkondi ensembles also often appeared to be threesomes: a husband, the male one, the wife, we'd see a beautiful example of one here, and Kozo, the dog. So Kozo, dog. The Kozo is often represented with two heads. They are seen, the dogs, as we saw, were thought to be able to detect intruders in the dark, including supernatural intruders. They were good rat hunters. Rats were associated with witches, so they were thought to be good witch hunters. They're represented with often with two heads because dogs were said to have 4 eyes, meaning they could see everything. And when people died, they were said to pass through an intermediary phase, which was the village of dogs on the way to the land of the dead. We, of course, even in Western mythology, have Cerberus, So we have our own dogs as watchkeepers at the gates of the land of the dead. So they are seen as mediators between the living and dead. And just between parentheses, when I say dead, remember I really mean the unliving. These are people between the moment of their death and their rebirth as something. It may not be as a person. It may even be as a waterfall or as a tree or something like that, a landmark. But the Bakongo do believe in reincarnation. So Kozo is often associated with bells. The Congolese hunting dogs are a breed that can't bark. And so in order to follow them in the jungle, the hunters put bells around their necks. And these bells are called mandibu. It's interesting to note that the statue that we're going to look at has two mandibu that look a little bit like guinea fowl wattles right under its chin. So it itself is, although it's anthropomorphic, associated with Kozo, the four-eyed omniscient dog. Kozo is often associated with women's affairs. Manjaka, the anthropomorphic statues, are usually associated with men's affairs. But we've already seen that this particular example that we're coming to is also associated very much with women's affairs, and it's associated with everybody's affairs. I love this statue. It's the wife of in an Nkondi assemblage called Mabyala. Unfortunately, the male component has disappeared. Here's testimony. Nkondi is an Nkisi in two sculptures, back to back. The powers of the male are more vigorous, but the female softens them. And by the way, this testimony, as with much testimony that when I have quotes, comes from the young Bakongo informants of a Swedish missionary who practiced, who asked his parishioners, his converts, to gather information about traditional practices in the early 20th century. They were extraordinarily observant and articulate ethnographers, recorders of oral history of their people, and we cannot be thankful enough for the clarity and the accuracy of their observations. If the two statues, were two males, many houses would be burned by the storm, unleashed by their power. So there needed to be a female and male and the dog to complement each other. The Nganga who would set off explosions to simulate the thunder that would be unleashed in the supernatural storm by the Nkondi assemblage, and to encourage the spirits associated with the statues to attack the communities and the petitioners' enemies. Minkondi brands and assemblages were often centered around a vigorous husband, and these vigorous husbands have, by some art historians, Africanists, and curators, referred to, lumped together as manjaka. Manjaka was statues with that name, from that brand, as it were, are known from the part of the Bakongo area that is now in Cabinda, Cabinda being the northern part of Angola that is squeezed between parts of Congo, the DRC, Congo Kinshasa. And the Manjaka refers to an Nkondi that could provoke chest pains and the vomiting of blood, but that is in the Western Congo dialect. There were other brands elsewhere. Mabiala was the one associated with the beautiful female statue that we just looked at. Mopunga was around in another area, and there were quite a few other brands. But I'm going to use the word Manjaka as a kind of shorthand. These anthropomorphic male statues were primarily meant to get retribution. As I said, they were meant to actually draw in and lodge the ghost, the spirit of a particular person. For example, a dead hunter warrior who, and to quote, killed much game, owned much livestock, and many slaves, one who was wily, wealthy, virile, and successful in fighting other clans, so that the ghost of this really powerful person could then be directed by the Nganga. The Nkondi basically is a kind of web. That's why it looks so disorderly to us, because it's drawing together so many different forms for composing meaning, for bringing together power through metaphor, metonymy, and syndaki, all of which were meant to sort of entrap and direct the spirit, and of course also to impress the clients. So the statue, or the being within the statue, had to be invoked, but also provoked. And you did this by cursing it, by driving hardware into it, by detonating explosions. Here is one of the invocations, demands made upon an Nkondi. Lord Mipumbo, bite his chest, bite his ribs. You are an Nkisi of the storm. Strike on high. If he stole, this being the malefactor, whoever that person is, someone out there who has done me wrong. If he stole this or that, go for him. And each Nkondi had its own sort of multitude, polyvalent powers. Some were known as a nailing Nkondi. We'll look at what nailing can signify in a moment. Some were for divination, a divinatory Nkondi. There could also be a flying Nkondi that could fly through the air to one's enemies wherever they were, basically to nail them. An Nkondi could be both a benefactor and a malefactor. So depending on what the client wanted and what the Nganga was willing to do, this same statue could be used for good or bad, as it were, for curing or killing, protecting or destroying. It could strike a person or protect him from lightning. It could cause or heal a skin disease, for example. It could do many things. They're virile. They often have very large penises. Hunting and the delivering of justice were seen as male activities. And one of the ways of provoking the spirit into action to do something other than just being a statue, doing nothing, being passive, was to strip the cloth off of its genitalia and expose it. This was an insult. It was an act of aggression, and it was also meant to shock the clients. They could not believe that the Nganga would go to that extreme to provoke the supernatural into action. They have very conventionalized postures. One of them, Pakalala, refers to leaning forward with the hands on the hips, ready for combat, but also to heal, defend, and destroy an enemy. It's a wrestler's posture. Young men who wish to show their arrogance walk with rounded shoulders and indrawn belly. As one informant said, that struck me because I think that young men in other cultures tend to do much the same thing. Or at least some of them. Another conventional posture was with the right arm brandishing a weapon. This is usually a lance, sometimes a knife. Here are two examples, one with the lance still in place and the other having lost its lance. The statue we're going to be looking at also had a right arm, almost certainly brandishing a lance, but termites have eaten it. And all that remains of it is a tiny fragment that, because of a nail into the arm, which got caught into a piece of wire around the statue's shoulder, it didn't fall off entirely. But there's just enough to see that it also had this particular conventional stance. One of the points where I disagree with a number of other scholars about Nkondi is their antiquity. I think they represent a very, very old class of objects. Some people have said that they were created as a response to the slave trade, and specifically to the slave trade in the 19th century. And the slave trade actually was decreasing during the 19th century once the British started blockading, stopping the slavers from getting from Africa over to the Americas. It withered. And so, but there's a lot of evidence that Nkondi already existed even before contact with Europeans, and that they are part of a class of objects called power figures that may be as old as the Bantu expansion, meaning that they may go back over 3,000 years. Here's an example. On the left, we see women walking and insulting an Nkondi-like statue in the Casamance of southern Senegal in the late 19th century. It doesn't have hardware stuck into it, but it's striking similarity to Nkondi. From thousands of miles away, in this photograph at the top right from 1930, we see Songye women, so they're even deeper into the Congo, in the central Congo, walking and insulting an Nkisi power figure. And then between the two, from Tenkodogo in Burkina Faso. Before 1950, a statue was again insulted and cursed as it was paraded through the streets in a ceremony, again related to women, conducted by women. And the similarity of these three points of evidence suggests that the use of power figures in this way is very old indeed. In 1491, the Portuguese first mentioned seeing statues that may have been like Nkondi. We see from an early print here from 1603, a statue in that shrine that may have been an ancestor of the Nkondi of the late 19th century. A man named Andrew Battelle saw a large fetish that was used to detect murderers, thieves, and witches, he said, between 1607 and 1610. So, and then Minkisi is mentioned for the first time in European text, in Western text, in 1650. So we're going back a long way before the 19th century, especially the late 19th century. Other early references, Ulfert Dapper in 1668 mentions a Nganga hammering pegs, Nzonzo, into a seated wooded Nkondi. By the way, I have seen seated wooded Nkondi myself, and that was on the Luango coast. The association of these so-called idols with cursing a witch and thunder and lightning is recorded in 1698. Again, they're associated with thunder in 1698. And then the word Nkondi first enters the literature in 1700, when it's used for a 1 meter tall male statue. We don't know whether it had hardware. But in 1816, so a long time before the Manjaka statues that were shown, for example, in the Met recently were made, they were actually ones in Nkondi with iron nails were recorded by a Captain Tuckey. What is the origin of these statues? I mentioned that the priest coming ashore at the moment of contact bore pictures of Saint Sebastian riddled with arrows. Robert Ferris Thompson argued that Nkondi are older than that they were not an example of borrowing totally from a European source. I happen to agree with him, as I've just demonstrated. But there's no doubt that they represented, as it were, a sculptural and spiritual medium for absorbing all the influences, and many of them being European, Western, on the Bakongo. I love this particular quote that comes from O'Hanlon. He was going up the Congo River, and he stopped at a Catholic mission, and he saw a so-called nail fetish, and he asked the white father, the monk, why he had that in his office. Here's the response. "I call him Saint Sebastian," said the monk. "He is a Congo nail fetish. When you are afraid because you have to go on a journey, or when you really want some one thing, good or bad, the sorcerer lets you see the fetish and takes your nail, and with it he pierces the fetish. One must get to know the enemy." It's interesting that the statue that we're going to be looking at was sold at the behest of a local Christian cleric who had basically co-opted its power. He'd taken the statue under his care, and therefore was then assimilated in people's minds with the statue's vestigial power. And when the statue seemed its significance was no longer much remembered, he instructed one of his parishioners to sell it so that his church could participate in the investiture of a new king. Another possible source for Nkondi is European fetishes. And here we have an example of two of them. There's considerable evidence that de-witching is still practiced in France. I actually encountered somebody in Paris only about 5 or 6 years ago who told me that she felt that she was under a curse and had hired a de-witcher to identify who had placed that curse on her. Jean Favre-Sada published a study on French de-witchers in the Norman countryside. Her study was about practices that were going on in the 1970s. But I can assure you they still go on, and I'm not talking about only among immigrants. They go on all over the countryside among people whose ancestors have been white French people going back for thousands of years. Another European comparison goes back to the 15th century. We see this zodiacal figure on the left stuck with all kinds of hardware. Such images would have reached the Bakongo, probably reinforcing their belief that Europeans had similar beliefs, and perhaps influencing even their construction of the Nkondi they were making at the time. Here in the United States and in Europe, people make bottle trees sometimes to catch marauding spirits. And there's the particular statue we're going to be looking at, and other ones, and also some of the Vaudan figures made by the Fon people in Benin, former Dahomey, use locks. So locks, padlocks, are, including the ones on the Passerelle des Arts, the Pont des Arts in Paris, are seen as sealing oaths, in this case, lovers' pledges to each other. That is true also among the Bakongo. The piercing of images is as old as art. Here we have a bison from the Salon Noir in the Neo cave in the Ariège of southern France. That's an hour south of Toulouse. I recommend that everyone who hears me at some point in their lives try to go to see Neo. It's open to the public. It will be one of the most spellbinding things that you can do in your life. You can see here that this particular bison has what appear to be 2 arrows or lances on its chest. Well, we've discussed this. Were Nkondi invented in the late 19th century in reaction to colonial pressures and the pressure of slavery? I've already said I don't think so. One of the reasons why it has been possible to argue that they were a reaction to colonial pressures as in the late 19th century is the problem of taphonomy. Taphonomy is the study of the disappearance of evidence with time. The further you go back in time, the more sparse your evidence is, because things get destroyed. And so your evidence set becomes weaker and weaker, and your data points fewer and fewer. But so most Nkondi were collected after 1880 because that's when there European demand for them developed. It's also when the Europeans for the first time were able to settle on shore on the Bakongo area. Remember that before that, the Bakongo had always traded with them while keeping them offshore on their ships. For the first time they were onshore, they could see the statues. Well, there were some incursions before that, but very brief, nothing that where traders had a constant presence. It's also assumed that Nkondi ended very quickly, so that it's assumed that they were reactions to colonial pressures starting around the 1880s, and that they ended by 1921 or shortly thereafter, because it's thought that there were so many forces, the introduction of missionaries, of colonial control, but also a religious revolution among the Bakongo themselves that we'll see in a moment, that led to their massive destruction in the early 1920s. I think that this assumption is baseless, that whites have exaggerated their influence. The reason why some people have argued that Nkondi could not have continued after the early 1920s is because the rise of a local prophet, as it were, Simon Kimbangu, who led an indigenous crusade against witchcraft. And he did have a significant effect, as Christian missionaries had, remember, all the way back into the 1490s when we saw the burning of idols. And yet, just as in the 1490s, that the massive burning of idols did not lead to the disappearance of Nkondi or Minkisi, I don't think that Simon Kimbangu's preachings converted everybody, but they certainly drove many practices underground. We saw that Christianity had not succeeded in wiping out Nkondi since 1483. We also saw that clerics co-opted some important figures, as in O'Hanlon's testimony, and that they also, when they didn't destroy them, that sometimes things were desacralized. For example, this one has lost its moyo. You can see the scar on its belly where it used to have a circular belly box with the sacralizing ingredients, the kind of Robert Farris Thompson's antenna. You can also see that it's lost its penis. Missionaries often knocked off the genitalia. When missionaries were not the only ones who knocked off the moyo, especially the moyo and the sacralizing, empowering materials that were also placed on the crown of the head, which was seen as the other center of being. The Bakongo themselves often did this before transferring the sculptures to Westerners, who they saw as profane, and they did not want to transfer something that was sacralized, that was spiritually empowered, to someone who was seen as being profane. It's interesting that the sculpture we're going to see is one of the best preserved, and it was not desacralized. It still had, or deconsecrated, it still has just about everything that was ever attached to it, which makes it especially interesting to analyze. Some scholars have said that none of the Nkondi and Western collections are still empowered. And they have looked at ones that have had their moyo removed, their genitalia removed, other things removed from them. That just simply, that's false. Here we have 3 examples where we see the moyo, and we see the sacralizing materials, which in center one include the materials attached as a beard around the chin. Sometimes, though, removing the bilongo does reveal hidden structures. I asked you earlier to remember the round compartment that's lost its top, which would have been a large cowrie shell or a piece of mica or glass, and revealing the cruciform partitions inside it. I think that circle with the cross inside it represents the Dikinga, which is the cosmogram that relates to the circle of life and death, the so-called 4 moments of the sun, or the cycle of reincarnation. As you can see, the Kalunga is the horizontal line across the middle, and that represents the surface of water, the interface between life and non-life. What looks disorderly and chaotic, when we get into the details and look at the specific structures on Nkondi, we find that they are highly structured. One of the things, another link to the Dikinga is a lozenge of 4 squares or 4 quadrants on the forehead of many of the statues. And these represent the 4 points of the ends of the cross within the Dikinga. So naturally, the Christian cross and the Dikinga, having so many resemblances, coexisted and led to syncretism. Syncretism being a fusion of religious practices. So a very pious Catholic, for example, in 1873, once he fell ill, decided that he would also have an Nkondi, Manjaka, brought to his home. I mean, better to be safe betting not just on one religion like Pascal, but in this case on two. We've seen that Nkisi appears back in 1624 as sacred and divine. So I think that Simon Kimbongu was only partly effective at suppressing Minkisi, especially the most powerful ones, because they had absorbed other influences. They had been able to withstand the onslaught of iconoclasts like him already for hundreds of years. But colonial officials and missionaries could not tolerate them. And they came to be seen as the epitome of savagery, brutality, barbarism, and almost one of the excuses proffered for why white people had to colonize Africa and bring in a more peaceful, orderly beliefs. So they became Western fetishes for illustrating devil worship. So here's a white stereotyping versus a Bakongo, a Congo person's vision of an Nkondi. Many whites saw Nkondi as the epitome of the negative, the violent model of vengeance. And here's a different view. An Nkondi is the name of the thing we use to help a man when he is sick, a chosen companion in whom all people find confidence, a hiding place for people's souls to keep and compose in order to breathe life. Otherwise, life and breath being synonyms in Kikongo. But these contrasting visions are actually rooted in contrasting visions among the Bakongo themselves of these statues. They're quite ambivalent about them. The first meaning describes Nkondi as tools and record keepers for dealing with mambu, or social issues. The second refers to them as hunters, dealers, or spies. So they're very ambiguous, and they represent both peace and violence. And most importantly, they were statues of war. So a British warship, the HMS Archer, which was sent to stop the slave trade, made a raid to try and stop the selling of slaves by a Bakongo chief, and seized this so-called war fetish in battle in 1865. By the way, that date predates the supposed rise of Manjaka in the late 19th century. Here's another example of the use of an Nkondi in war. My men found the great 120 centimeter tall, that's tall, war fetish, which had been brought to the front line and abandoned by its porters once they found themselves surrounded, believing with good reason that this idol was a hostage more important than a human one. I refused a king's offer of ransom, burned his house, and forced him to pay tribute. That was the self-congratulatory testimony of a Belgian colonial officer named Alex Del Commune about a battle that he had in the Boma region. So the martial statue that we're going to look at the conclusion of this talk fits into a long tradition of such martial Minkondi. Here are some examples. There's Commander Wilmot's war fetish from 1865, one with a gun and a helmet in the center, another one with a gun and a helmet on the right. Often the ones that were martial and that had allusions to Western military equipment were either ignored as being not truly indigenous or adulterated by museums. They seem to be too polluted by European influences and just didn't fit into curatorial canons. But when you look at them, yeah, just starting with their nails, for example, many of the nails, many of the screws and bolts and other materials on them, even on the very oldest ones that have survived, were imports. And so the conclusion that a helmet or a gun is inappropriate is just misguided. The World War I Nkondi goes further than all the others in appropriating and assimilating European objects and influences, because it seems to have been largely a response to the fighting in Europe itself. There are a lot of precedents. On the shoulder of one Manjaka Nkondi are the sear components from a flintlock musket. Before we go through that portal, we're about to open that door. We're gonna stop and pet its dog for a moment, Kozo. The soldier's companion. Kozo has a kundu on the back with horns sticking out of it. Remember, the kundu represents the witch's gland, the activating thing which brings in the supernatural abilities of it also has a bone serving as one of its back legs. Here's another example with its sacralizing materials on the sides and as a moyu on the back. And now we open the door. We're going to start at the top and we're going to go down. The first thing you notice is a facsimile of a military helmet. This is over another hat, a chief's cap called a mupu, which would have been worn by notables, court officials, and high trade officials. It also has a big hook between the helmet and each ear. The fact that the hooks are symmetrical on each side is true also for some of the lower things. You'll see just below on the neck, two large bolts sticking out symmetrically. We're just beginning to see that in apparent chaos, disorder, there is a lot of order when you look more closely. One of the more striking things, totally original to the statue, I believe, is that it has straight brown European hair stretching around the back of the head from ear to ear. This is probably monkey or antelope fur, but it's so different from the hair applied to any of the other statues I've looked at, and there are a great many throughout equatorial Africa that incorporate human hair, but they all incorporate indigenous, kinky African hair, not a facsimile of white brown hair. This seems to associate it with whites. We saw an Nkisi statue a moment ago wearing a helmet and bearing a gun that had a white face and appeared to be a representation and assimilation of a white officer who, as a representative of the dead, a powerful representative of the dead, was being controlled through that statue. Another feature of the statue is diastema. That is, it's not just that it has sort of the lucky gap between the incisors, but they've been filed as a sign of beauty and prestige among the Bakongo. Just one more word about the helmet. It seems to be a facsimile of the American doughboy's helmet, as opposed to the Adrian helmet worn by French troops, which had a sagittal crest. The eyes, like the eyes on other Nkondi, are reflective and refer to the Kalunga, but they're combined here with arched eyebrows and very faint wrinkles up in the middle of the forehead. The combination of the three is very reminiscent of the classic 1,000-yard stare of people who've suffered such cataclysmic shocks that they have PTSD. It's an involuntary expression. Many of the Bakongo veterans demobilized back to the Congo would have returned with just such expressions. We're going to move down to the neck. In the two drawings on the left, you can see just under the chin and just at the base of the skull at the back, a horizontal fang, a tooth that may have been meant to be read as a feline fang. So the head is, as it were, clenched in the grip of a leopard or lion or some animal. It is under control. It is, on both sides, it has railroad spikes or bolts. Around the base of the neck, there is a circle of 3 padlocks in front and 1 padlock in the back. So the entire base of the neck is under control of not only a chain, but of 4 padlocks. The padlock, in the easiest padlock to see is in the just under the chin. You can see its hoop, and it's right at the center. You can also see that in the keyhole of it in the photograph at top right. Another feature is the mandibu, the dog bells, which are 2, in the picture at top left, they are like 2 green dewlaps underneath the horizontal blue tooth. There are hundreds of attachments on the body, which has lost, as I said, its right arm, which would have been raised in the canonical stance, probably bearing a lance. We see some of them here, some of the attachments. We're going to get into more detail in a moment. But going just by letter on the left, The first one is the bottom of a glass that is probably meant to represent the full moon. B is a wooden sculpture of an antelope head. F is the logo of a B&J, of the B&J Briegelson and Jacobson Serenader trumpet. And H is one of the padlocks. G is a padlock with the image of a lion's head with its seen in profile with an open mouth. And so remember that I said that the bottom of the head seemed to have fangs clamping it front and back, and then seemed to be under the further control of a circle of padlocks. One of those padlocks actually has the image of a roaring lion on it. And then the last of the last image, bottom at the bottom right of the picture on the left, is of one of the grenades. So we can't go into all the details, but let's start and look at a few of them. We looked at that glass, which represents the moon. We looked at the antelope head. We looked at the B&J Serenader trumpet logo. And we're going to go further now to look at structures, the structures they form. So the moyo is clearly framed not only by a wooden frame with brass upholstery tacks, but by a gigantic hippo tusk and a triangle of probable grenades. You can see them at the top, both the top corners and in the center bottom of the belly box. These three, along with the big spike above the tusk, form a lozenge, and the lozenge can refer to a network of ancestors who grant chiefly power. There are hidden structures too. Above the hippo tusk, shown in blue, lying across the top of the moyo, are four vertical horns. The two outer ones are white. They are horn cores, so they would be perceived as dead. And the two inner ones are black, so they still have their black sheaths, and they would have been seen as similar to the horns on living animals. Between them are a number of circular things, including the one underneath the glass, as you can just see it behind the chain there, a little green circle, and that is approximately where you might find the navel if it once it's been displaced by the belly box. We'll see what that is. Let's go down though a little further we saw that the bottommost grenade looks like it's in a position to be a penis, but behind it there is the figurative, finely sculpted penis and scrotum, and beneath that, the gourd that has been lashed into place with wire to catch whatever is dripping out of the penis. So near the genitals are a small bell, a little green small bell right in front of the gourd. You can see it there at the center in the drawing on the left. That could be rung to activate that area, as it were. There are also little small shells, which are shown in blue here, These are the dogs that are meant to attach a particular petitioner's to the request that petitioner has made. And all of this is connected to musical instruments such as the whistle, which is in green in the image underneath the green iron bell, which is itself beneath the third instrument, which is the trumpet. Every spike, nail, and blade has a significance and a particular name depending on its form, and each one of these names and forms is associated with a particular act, a particular intervention to try to punish somebody who's doing one supernatural harm, to detect someone, to seal a contract. We'll go to one of these. We'll go down to the spikes. The spikes were used when a person tied mambu. In this case, you hammer more strongly than when driving in a blade. And this heaviness of force symbolizes serious crimes like murder. It's interesting also that Nganga could have it both ways. If a client paid a Nganga to insert a nail, mupuya, the target of that act might pay the same Nganga to extract it. So it was 1 shilling to insert a nail and 30 or 40 to withdraw it. So religion pays. I think it's particularly interesting also that Albert Messen thinks that nails were sometimes added in thanks. That's particularly important in this case of an Nkondi that may have been a reaction to the First World War, when many people were demobilized after being wounded and wondered why they had survived as opposed to their comrades, and wanted to give thanks for their survival. That may explain why this Nkondi is one of the most heavily covered with hardware of all of them known. If only we could know the stories associated with all this hardware, each piece of which is associated with an incident, a story, a tragedy, a desire, we would be able to reconstruct much of the history of these people. The spikes, for example, were probably extracted from the railway bridges and tracks that Joseph Conrad saw being built and which he memorialized at the beginning of Heart of Darkness. Almost every piece on this statue records a spell, a contract, a court judgment, an alliance. And only one person knew them all, was responsible for memorizing all of them and their links, and that was the Nganga. He was, in effect, the people's historian. Here's a person in Belgium in 1886 recognizing that fact. Rather than an idol, this is a history book or communal archive. And this statue is, in effect, a metaphor for the work of a historian. Padlocks. Padlocks, of course, were used to keep slaves prisoner. The 4 padlocks circle the neck, 3 in front, 1 in back, 1 with the lion's head that we see at top right. The spirits inside were locked into the statues in the parlance of the Bananga in Kikongo. It's interesting that in the manifest of slave ships, one of the things that they were bringing to the Luongo coast, at least, was padlocks. So they seem to have been used for a long time. Once again, the lion there is related, refers to the word Nkosi, which is an alternative term for an Nkondi and also for one's master, one's lord. Then there are networks of local rope, industrial string, chains, and wires. The artisanal rope is under other networks and is more degraded, suggesting that this statue is even older than the First World War, that it assumed new meaning in light of the war, had new things added to it in light of the war. The same thing is true of the chief's cap, the mopu, which is under the facsimile of the military helmet. The mopu is seen on other Minkondi made before the First World War. This may well be an Nkondi that was made before the war and then achieved its crescendo of effects and importance in light of that conflict. What do the networks do? Do they link transactions? Do they control the Nkondi, like the nets perhaps on some other Minkondi, unlike the padlocks? Or are they mnemonic ideograms? I don't know. Much remains to be learned about this statue. Here's an example of an Nkondi surrounded by hunting nets. Specifically, these are nets spread through the understory of a jungle, and then people would form a line and have a beat to drive prey, small antelope, for example, towards the nets, and they would be caught. So this is the net here not only represents the Nkondi's capacities as a hunter, a supernatural hunter, but were perhaps meant to control it. We've looked at the shells, the small marine shells tied with wire that are the dogs, tying petitioners to the supernatural request via tied onto the nails. The big tree snails, we referred to them in relation to puns. So the tree snails refer to childbirth, the strengthening of the body. Kodya evokes kola, to be strong, and the spiral form of the snail, Kazinga, evokes Dizinga, or long life. It's covered with horns and tusks. We saw the big antelope horn on the back. We've also saw the white horn cores and black horns that form a palisade above the hippo tusk and the moyo. And then there's a goat horn on the right arm. This is interesting because there is another Nkondi with many of the same objects in exactly the same places. And that one is in a museum in Cologne, Germany, suggesting that the objects were attached probably by the very same Nganga. Bones and teeth. Well, we've seen that the neck is clamped between fangs, front and back. There are other bones hidden all over the statue, as well as teeth. There's the antelope head hidden under metal. I almost missed it on the back of the right leg. Here's a photograph of it. You can see it in the welter of hardware. It's beautifully sculpted. And it probably refers to the spirit's capacity again as a hunter. There's a lead penis and scrotum. That is in picture B. And there's a bridle. The bridle is interesting. It's seen as D in the drawing, and in the bottom picture E of the photograph, composite photograph. Oh no, I'm sorry. Those are two. It's D in the composite photograph. Beneath it, E are two interlaced bracelets that were used as currency and had further meanings. The bridle is a reference to the introduction of horses around 1880 to 1882. Very first horses were brought in. They could not survive because of the tsetse fly and sleeping sickness. They were even more vulnerable to it than humans. There was different forms of sleeping sickness, but it particularly killed horses. And so in the brief time that they were around, they were seen as magical creatures, as just astonishing things. And an early Nkondi was actually in the form not of a human being, but of a horse. Unfortunately, that statue has disappeared. Gas and training grenades, and a trench mortar. Here we have a variety of these different canisters. You can see they're factory sealed. And then there are some examples of grenades in the picture between the two drawings, at the top between the two drawings. Now we come to that circle just in the center of the palisade of horns, above the hippo tusk, which forms a kind of parade belt across the top of the moyo. This knob comes from the very best, most versatile and brightest, best designed military trench lantern in the First World War. It was the Aida trench lantern. The Aida trademark starts in 1906. When Allied troops would get into the German trenches, they would look for these lanterns because they were so much better than any of the lanterns provided Allied troops. There are also, that regulatory knob, by the way, is at the base of the Dikinga cosmogram, hidden on the chest of the statue at the point that refers to the south, femaleness, and the lowest point in the sun's cycle. So if you have the regulatory knob there, you're able to which can darken or brighten a flame. You basically have a wonderful symbol for the ability to re-illuminate the spiritual cycle from death back to life. Let's compare levels of violence. One of the excuses that colonists used for imposing Western culture, civilization on colonial people, colonized people, was that European Western civilization was much more orderly and peaceful. The First World, when the imperial powers ran out of cannon fodder to throw at each other in the First World War, the greatest violence that had ever happened on the planet until that time, they started drawing upon exploited populations on both sides of the Atlantic for manpower. And so they had to bring African Americans and Africans, for example, and even Kanaks from New Caledonia, to the heart of their continent, to Europe, and put them and arm them and tell them to kill whites, where it was revealed to them that the white civilization could be more violent than any other civilization in the world, far more than any violence that these people had ever seen back home. During the First World War, Bakongo were appalled to hear of the continuing slaughter in Europe, their own wars being essentially divinatory ordeals or trials by combat, ended after the first casualties. This is from a study by Wyatt McGaffey, who is one of the great Africanist scholars of Bakongo culture. Musical instruments. Well, we saw the military whistle, the konki whistle, signifying the cry of the Ntoyo bird. These are big diurnal birds that when they cry during the day, it doesn't mean much. But when they cry at night, it signifies that the Ganga and his Nkondi are out hunting malefactors and that someone is going to die. We looked at the mandabu, the dog bells that suggested this being has the capacity of a dog to detect intruders even in the dark, malefactors even in the dark. We saw the iron bell beneath the trumpet. That's picture C. That refers to the legendary Bakongo blacksmith kings. We saw the other bells related to Kozo, but also these are small servant bells in this case, not a blacksmith bell, the kind that Belgian officials, colonial families used to call their servants, but which a Nganga could use to summon the spirit inside the Nkondi. And then, of course, there's the trumpet on the left of the statue from our point of view. This is, as I said, the B&J, Bwiegelsson and Jacobson Serenader trumpet. It was actually made in Milan by Romeo Orsi, which had been making trumpets sturdy, cheap, brass instruments specifically for military bands since 1881, and exporting them to the United States, where they were sold on 17th Street in Manhattan. There is a B&J Serenader trumpet with the serial number on the second valve, 2212, and it's dated 1892. That's earlier than official records show B&J selling these trumpets, but I think it's incontrovertible that they were selling them before the surviving records indicate. By the serial number on this trumpet is 4328. That places it squarely within the final years of the First World War. Bwiegelsson and Jacobson specifically sold its trumpets to musicians leaving New York to go to with the American Expeditionary Force, as the American Army in Europe was known at that time. And one of the major, there were 27 African-American military bands with the American Expeditionary Force. The one that we know was leaving from New York was the Harlem Hellfighters. Here's our director standing at the left side of this picture, on the right, James Reese Europe. He was an extraordinary man in terms of his effect of introducing jazz basically to the world. And also as a correspondent. He wrote wonderful articles for the African-American press from Europe. The picture at bottom left shows African-American musicians upon their return to New York with instruments bent at the front, which they termed casualties. So basically, bands, these 27 African-American brass bands, and 3 primarily, introduced jazz not only to Europe and by extension the world, but even back to white Americans who had not really been giving it. They'd been rather disdainful, contemptuous of early jazz. But when these bands went to Europe, and in one case, for example, landed playing a jazzed up version of La Marseillaise, they got everybody tapping their feet, and even senior officers in the high command, and even the president of France, Raymond Poincaré. And when French journalists saw the officers tapping their feet, they thought, wow, if it's good enough for the president, good enough for them, it must be great stuff. So they started singing its praises. And then the American white journalists who were in Europe basically just to report on the exploits of American white troops saw the French press going wild about African-American brass bands. After all, the French were the world's cultural arbiters. So they didn't have, white American journalists didn't have much good news to report back to the United States. So I thought, well, the French like something American. We'll report on this. And it broke the ice back in the United States. A lot of whites began to pay attention to jazz and look forward to the homecoming of these bands. And indeed, 3 of them got touring contracts, which was the equivalent of big recording contracts back then, and became famous. The Harlem Hellfighters, though, they not only played for the president, and not only the Harlem Hellfighters, the Black Devils and other bands, and for the high senior officers, they had to fight, and they fought hard. They were sent to a part of the front directly north of Paris, on the Aisne and Oise watersheds. That was so segregated that it was nicknamed in French l'Afrique, Africa. And the American troops were placed directly beside African troops. These, for the most part, were so-called tirailleurs sénégalais, meaning Senegalese marksmen. But anyone with dark-colored skin, whether they came from French territories in the Pacific or along the coast of India, which there were a few, were thrown into the tirailleurs sénégalais. And among those tirailleurs sénégalais were Bakongo troops. This sector, l'Afrique, included Bolu Wood, where the Harlem Hellfighters fought with the French 16th Division. The Americans didn't want them fighting next to American white troops, and didn't want African Americans fighting at all, because they thought that they might end up thinking that they had earned certain respect, certain rights. And so but the French were pleading for manpower. And so about 27,000, I believe, African-American troops were given to the French with a secret letter telling the French to mistreat them so they would not come back thinking they had earned any rights. To his credit, a French politician read this letter out in l'Assemblée nationale, the French Congress, French House of Representatives, and this shamed the American High Command a little bit. But it should be said that during the First World War, African Americans, for the first time, were raised in significant numbers to the level of officers within the US military. So at Bolu Wood, the Hellfighters and the Tirailleurs Sénégalais, the Chauffeurs d'Afrique, and the Légion étrangère took side-by-side towns in June and then July of 1918. The 369th Infantry, so the Harlem Hellfighters, as they were nicknamed, spent more time in combat, 191 days, than any other American unit in the war, and it was the first to reach the Rhine. Thousands of Bakongo troops served in the Tirailleurs Sénégalais and in the Belgian Corps de Volontaires Congolais. They were often supposed volunteers, but of course there were forced levies on chiefs who had to come up with a certain number of quote-unquote volunteers. They lost huge numbers, 7,000 out of 15,500 at the Chemin des Mains. 81,000 died in battle out of 600,000 from the French colonies. African and African American troops met in the trenches, in hospitals, ports, railroad yards, and rest areas. Combat labor and social fraternization brought both African American and African colonial soldiers into close contact with each other throughout 1918. That's from a book by Chad Williams called A Mobilized Diaspora. Most of African Americans served as laborers, often with Africans, on loading, unloading ships and railroad cars, for example. They were also sent to the same hospitals. Here we have a picture of a wounded Black American with in a hospital also used for African troops in Paris. These brass bands, these 27 brass bands, created a bridge between Blacks from the two sides of the ocean. Here's a quote from Jim Europe in the New York Age, an African-American newspaper. "I have never seen one Black French soldier without some sort of decoration, and I have met thousands. Many of the men have become fluent French talkers, and I have heard animated conversations between Black American men and the Senegalese who chanced to be passing." Now, of course, some of those Senegalese were probably Bakongo, because he's just referring here to all the soldiers in the Tirailleurs Sénégalais. This meeting of Black Africans and Black Americans was utterly explosive, which is in keeping with the image of an Nkondi, especially an Nkondi covered with grenades. After being told that whites had a civilizing mission, all of a sudden they saw how brutal whites could be to each other. They were even told to kill whites. They were armed to do so. They also were in the real heart of darkness. The real heart of darkness, bought not being in the Congo, where Joseph Conrad placed it, but 100 kilometers north of Paris. And in the trenches, and while when meeting each other in no man's land, while collecting bodies, as they were often sent out to do, and back in R&R while listening to the brass bands, they were able to compare notes. So it's not surprising that in 1919, one of the co-founders of the NAACP, Burkhart Dubois, was writing a book about Black Americans in the war. And the first African in the French Chamber of Deputies, the Assemblée Nationale, Blaise Digne, convened the Pan-African Congress to call for the end of racial discrimination and colonial rule. The result was that Blacks returned to Africa wanting independence and to America wanting civil rights, strengthened civil rights. The abolitionist movement had largely led to only a partial victory, a largely Pyrrhic victory, and the First World War led in some ways to its reanimation in a modern form. But white mobs lynched 70 Black American veterans, some in uniform, in the first year after the war. First World War also planted the seeds of Congolese independence. And after the war, a Congolese veteran, a former prisoner of war, scholar named Paul Panda Farnama, who's shown in the middle here. This picture, by the way, is taken, it's a staged photograph by the Germans showing a representative of each type of soldier they had captured. He represented a Belgian Congolese soldier. He was not simply a representative of a type, as he's meant to be in this German propaganda photograph. He was a remarkable individual who by this time had earned two important diplomas. In any case, after the war, he had asked the Belgian government for something simple, a statue to honor the unknown Congolese soldier. The man who had captured one of the Nkondi in battle, Alexandre Delcommune, then in 1919 wrote another thing. L'avenir de Congo menacé, the future of the Congo as a colony menaced. Sure enough, in 1920, after being spurned in his request to have a statue to honor the unknown Congolese soldier, Farnama and his organization, the Union Congolaise, demanded that forced labor be ended and that Congolese be allowed to vote, serve as legislators, become doctors. Here we have a Congolese doctor today, and win promotions to the top of the civil service. The march towards independence had begun with a simple request to honor soldiers with a statue. But in Nganga, in the Congo, had already found an indigenous way of honoring the Bakongo dead, and they're meeting with brothers from the other side of the world. Thank you.